The goat charged again, and Alara Whitfield barely jumped out of the way in time, landing hard on her elbow in the mud. The wooden pail flew from her hand and rolled across the yard, spilling the little milk she had managed to collect. Somewhere behind the fence, she heard laughter, high and bright, 3 young voices rising together like bells. She had arrived at the Blackthorn estate only 4 days ago, carrying nothing but a worn bag, and a story she had rehearsed so many times it no longer felt like her own. She was an Omega, and Omegas were not supposed to want much. They were supposed to stay quiet, work hard, and never draw attention to themselves. That was the rule she had lived by since the day her birth pack turned her away, calling her too fragile, too soft, a waste of a bloodline that had once produced strong warriors. She had believed them for a long time. She was starting to believe them a little less. The goat, a large gray animal with crooked horns and eyes that seemed to hold a personal grudge against her, stood a few feet away, chewing something invisible, and watching her with what looked like satisfaction. The stable hands called him Duke, and they said it with a kind of nervous respect, the same way soldiers might speak about an enemy general. Nobody wanted to milk Duke. Nobody had managed it in weeks. And so, naturally, the newest and lowest worker on the estate had been given the job. Alara pushed herself up, wiped her hands on her apron, and retrieved the pail. It had a dent in the side now, to match the one from yesterday. She was fairly sure the stool did not have long to live either. "You're going to lose," said a small voice. She turned and found 3 children peering over the low fence that separated the goat pen from the garden path. The tallest, a boy with dark hair and his father's sharp eyes, looked to be about 8 years old. Beside him stood a girl a couple of years younger, her hair in 2 uneven braids, clearly done by someone in a hurry. The smallest, a boy of perhaps 4, was mostly interested in trying to climb the fence rail, which put him at constant risk of falling into the mud himself. "I am not going to lose," Alara said, brushing dirt from her sleeve. "I am simply gathering information about my opponent." The girl giggled. "Duke doesn't lose. He bit Garrett last month. Garrett is the biggest guard in the whole kingdom." "Then Garrett and I have something in common," Alara said. "We have both underestimated a goat." The boy with dark hair studied her for a moment, the way children sometimes study adults when they are deciding whether or not to trust them. "You talk funny," he said, "not like the other workers." Alara felt a small flicker of alarm, quickly smoothed over. She had spent years learning how to blend into a crowd, how to speak plainly, how to fold away anything that might mark her as different. Apparently, a few days of exhaustion and goat-related failure had worn down her careful habits. "I suppose I read too many books as a child," she said lightly. "It gives a person strange manners." "I like books," the girl said. "Ren likes them. That's me. I'm Ren." "And I'm Finn," said the older boy, still watching her carefully. "Milo," announced the smallest one, who had finally abandoned the fence and was now sitting in the dirt, looking pleased with himself, for no particular reason. "It's very nice to meet all of you," Alara said, and meant it, though she kept half an eye on Duke, who had begun wandering toward the fence with an air of great innocence that fooled no one. "I am Alara. I work with the animals here." "You work with Duke," Finn corrected. "Nobody else will." "Even old Garrick said no, and he's not scared of anything." "Old Garrick has clearly never met this particular goat," Alara said, picking up the stool and setting it a safe distance away, out of range of what she now understood to be an impressively accurate set of horns. "I intend to succeed where old Garrick failed. It is a matter of principle now." Ren climbed halfway up the fence to get a better view. "Can we watch?" Alara hesitated. She was fairly certain that entertaining the king's children was not part of her job, and she was even more certain that if she failed spectacularly in front of them, word would travel through the estate faster than a grass fire. But there was something in Ren's eager face, something hopeful, and a little lonely, that made it difficult to say no. She had noticed, in her short time here, how quiet the great house often was. Too quiet for a home with 3 children in it. "You may watch," Alara said, "but if I am struck by a flying hoof, I expect you to fetch help and not laughter." "No promises," Finn said, and for the first time, something like a smile crossed his serious young face. Alara approached Duke slowly this time, murmuring the same low, steady words she used with every difficult animal, the kind of voice that asked for patience, rather than demanded obedience. Duke's ears flicked toward her, then away, weighing his options. She settled onto the stool at an angle she hoped would keep her out of headbutting range, and reached for the pail. For one hopeful moment, nothing happened. Duke stood still, and Alara allowed herself to believe, foolishly, that today might be different. Then he took 2 quick steps sideways, and knocked the stool clean out from under her. She hit the ground with a soft grunt, and behind the fence, all 3 children burst into laughter, the kind that comes from deep in the stomach and cannot be stopped. Even Milo, who probably had no idea what was funny, was laughing simply because his siblings were. Alara lay in the dirt for a moment, staring up at the gray afternoon sky, and found, to her own surprise, that she wanted to laugh too. It had been a long time since anyone had laughed near her without cruelty in it. The sound coming over that fence was not mocking, it was delighted. "You are all terrible," she called out, sitting up, "and I am reconsidering our friendship." "You're funny," Ren announced, as if this settled the matter completely. "Do it again." "I would prefer not to do it again," Alara said, retrieving the stool once more. "But Duke seems to have other plans." She tried a different approach this time, offering the goat a handful of grain from her pocket, letting him take his time, refusing to rush the moment the way she had before. Duke chewed thoughtfully, considering the peace offering, and Alara felt a small flicker of hope. Perhaps patience, rather than persistence, was the answer. She was wrong. The moment she reached for the pail again, Duke headbutted it clean out of her hands, sending it clattering across the yard, and then, with what could only be described as pure mischief, trotted a small victory circle around her. "He's showing off now," Finn said, grinning properly for the first time. "He does that," Ren agreed. "Papa says he's the most stubborn animal on the whole estate." At the mention of their father, Alara felt a small tightening in her chest, though she kept her face pleasant. She had seen the king only from a distance so far, a tall, broad-shouldered figure who moved through the estate with the kind of weight that came from carrying too much for too long. The staff spoke of him in hushed, careful tones. Some called him fair, others called him cold. Most agreed that since his wife had passed, something in him had gone quiet, like a fire banked too low to give real warmth. "Your father must be a very patient man," Alara said carefully, "to put up with this goat." "Papa doesn't come near Duke," Milo offered helpfully. "Duke bit his boot once." "A wise decision on your father's part," Alara said. "I am beginning to think Duke has bitten or headbutted everyone of importance on this estate, and I am simply the next unfortunate name on his list." She retrieved the pail again, resettled the stool, and tried once more, this time humming softly under her breath, an old, wordless tune her grandmother used to sing to calm nervous animals before a storm. Duke's ears swiveled toward the sound, curious despite himself, and for a few precious seconds, he stood still enough that Alara actually managed to draw a small amount of milk before he shifted his weight and nearly toppled her again. "You got some," Ren shouted, delighted, as if Alara had accomplished some great heroic feat rather than a single unimpressive squirt of milk into an otherwise empty pail. "A small victory," Alara agreed, catching her breath. "I will take what I can get." The 3 children cheered anyway, Milo clapping his small hands together with great enthusiasm, and Alara felt something warm unfold in her chest, something she had not expected to feel on an ordinary afternoon, spent losing an argument with livestock. She had come to this kingdom expecting nothing more than quiet, anonymous survival. She had not expected an audience. She certainly had not expected to enjoy having one. She tried 3 more times before the light began to fade, and each attempt ended in some new form of defeat, though none quite so dramatic as the first fall. By the end, her hair had come loose from its braid, her apron was streaked with mud, and she had exactly enough milk in the pail to make the effort feel almost worthwhile. The children, for their part, had grown steadily louder and more invested, offering advice that ranged from genuinely useful to wildly impractical. "You should sing to him the whole time," Ren suggested. "Not just at the start. You should bribe him with more grain," Finn said. "A lot more grain." "You should let me try," Milo said, though he was promptly overruled by both of his siblings, who seemed to remember, even at their young ages, that goats and small children rarely ended well together. It was Finn who first noticed the tall shadow falling across the yard. and his laughter died in his throat so quickly that Alara turned to see what had caused it. Standing at the edge of the path, arms crossed, expression unreadable, was the man she had only glimpsed from a distance until now. Up close, he was even more imposing, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired like his son, with a face that might have been handsome if it did not look so permanently guarded. His eyes moved from his children to Alara, taking in her muddy apron, her loose hair, the dented pail at her feet. "Papa," Ren said, a little too brightly, the way children do when they suspect they might be in trouble. "We were just watching Alara. She's trying to milk Duke." The king's gaze settled on Alara for a long moment, and she felt herself straighten under it, suddenly aware of exactly how she must look. She had imagined, in the vague way one imagines unlikely futures, that if she ever met the Alpha King properly, it would be in some composed, dignified moment, not covered in mud with hay clinging to her hair. "I was told the new hand had been assigned to the goat," he said finally, his voice low and even, giving nothing away. "I did not expect a full audience." "They found their own way here, Your Majesty," Alara said, dipping into as respectful a bow as her aching body allowed. "I take full responsibility for the entertainment value of my failures." Something flickered across his face, there and gone, so quickly she almost missed it. Not quite a smile, something smaller, more surprised. "Duke has defeated better handlers than you," he said. "Old Garrick refuses to go near him." "So I have been told, Your Majesty, repeatedly, by your children in fact, with great enthusiasm." Finn shifted uncomfortably, clearly expecting a reprimand, but his father's attention had already returned to Alara, studying her with an expression she could not quite name. Curiosity, perhaps, or simple surprise at finding someone who spoke to him without the careful fear most of his staff seemed to carry. "You should stop for today," he said. "The light is going. With respect, Your Majesty, I would rather not leave Duke thinking he has won entirely." This time, the flicker at the corner of his mouth was unmistakable, though he mastered it quickly. "As you wish," he said, and there was something almost like approval in the words, though his tone remained carefully neutral. "Finn, Ren, Milo, inside, all of you. Your supper is waiting, and I imagine Nora is already wondering where you have gone." The children groaned in unison, but they obeyed, filing past their father with the particular speed of children who know they have pushed their luck about as far as it will go for one day. Ren paused just long enough to look back over her shoulder. "You'll try again tomorrow, won't you?" she called. "I will," Alara promised. "Duke and I have unfinished business." The king lingered a moment longer than his children, his gaze drifting once more to the dented pail, the small puddle of milk at the bottom of it, the mud on Alara's sleeves. "You could ask to be reassigned," he said quietly. "Nobody would think less of you for it." "I would think less of myself," Alara said, and she meant it. "I have been called weak before, Your Majesty. I find I am not eager to prove it true over a goat." He studied her for a long beat, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then, without another word, he turned and followed his children toward the house, his tall shadow stretching long across the yard in the fading light. Alara stood alone with Duke, who had settled contentedly into the corner of his pen, as though he had personally orchestrated the entire encounter for his own amusement. She looked down at the small, hard-won puddle of milk in her pail, and, despite the mud and the bruises and the aching elbow, found herself smiling. "Tomorrow," she told the goat, "you will not be so lucky." Duke chewed thoughtfully and said nothing, which she decided to take as a challenge accepted. Behind her, from an upstairs window she had not noticed before, a curtain shifted very slightly, as though someone had been standing there a moment longer than necessary, before finally stepping away. Morning came gray and cool, with a mist still clinging to the low fields when Alara pulled on her boots and headed for the goat pen. She had slept poorly, her body sore from yesterday's tumbles, but there was a strange lightness in her chest that had nothing to do with rest. She kept thinking of Ren's laughter, of Milo clapping his small hands, of Finn's rare, careful smile. She kept thinking, too, of the king's face in that last unguarded moment before he turned away. She told herself it meant nothing. Kings did not concern themselves with omegas who mucked out pens and lost arguments with livestock. She was simply someone new, a brief curiosity in a household that had likely seen very little new in a long while, that was all. Duke was waiting for her by the fence, looking, as always, entirely too pleased with himself. "Good morning," Alara told him. "I hope you slept well, because I certainly did not, and I intend to take it out on you." Duke flicked an ear and wandered a few steps away, unimpressed by the threat. She had barely set down her pail when she heard footsteps on the path, lighter and quicker than the king's had been. Wren appeared first, hair once again in uneven braids, followed closely by Finn, who was trying very hard to look like he had not run the whole way from the house. "You're actually here," Wren said, sounding delighted, as though she had half expected Alara to have fled in the night. "I told you I would be," Alara said. "I do not go back on my word, even to goats." "Where's Milo?" she asked, glancing toward the path. "Nora wouldn't let him come," Finn said, climbing onto the fence rail with practiced ease. "She said yesterday was enough excitement for one small boy. He cried about it for a while, but then he found a beetle, so he's fine now." "A fair trade," Alara agreed, and set to work. The morning's attempts went much like the previous days, though Alara noticed small improvements in herself if not in Duke. She had learned, at least, to angle her body away from his horns, and she had discovered that a particular low hum, closer to a growl than a song, seemed to hold his attention a fraction longer than her earlier tune had. It was not enough to win outright, but it was progress, and she found herself strangely proud of it. "You're getting better," Wren announced after the fourth attempt, which ended with Alara sitting in the dirt, but at least still holding onto the pail. "High praise," Alara said, standing and brushing herself off. "I shall treasure it always." Finn had grown quieter as the morning went on, watching Alara with the same careful, assessing look he had given her the day before. Eventually, as she reset the stool for another attempt, he spoke. "Why do you keep trying? Everyone else just gives up after the first day." Alara considered the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "I suppose because giving up has never done much for me," she said. "I was told once that I was not suited for difficult things. I believed it for longer than I should have. Now I think I would rather find out for myself what I am and am not suited for, even if it means losing to a goat every single morning." Finn was quiet for a moment. "Someone told you that? That you weren't suited for things?" "A few someones," Alara said lightly, though there was an old ache beneath the words that she did not let show. "It does not matter now. I have decided they were wrong, and I intend to prove it, one stubborn animal at a time." Wren, who had been listening intently, tilted her head. "Nobody tells you that here. You're good at things. You made Duke stand still for almost a whole minute yesterday." "Nobody's done that." The simple sincerity of it caught Alara off guard, and she found herself blinking back an unexpected sting behind her eyes. She had grown so used to bracing against unkindness that kindness, when it came, sometimes struck harder than any insult ever had. "Thank you, Wren," she said softly. "That means more than you know." They were interrupted by the sound of the side door opening, and all three of them turned to see a woman hurrying down the path, her apron half-tied, her expression a careful mix of exasperation and relief. "There you are," the woman said, catching sight of Finn and Wren. "I have been looking everywhere. Your father wants you both for your lessons, and I told him I had no idea where you had run off to, which was, I now realize, a lie." "Sorry, Nora," Wren said, not sounding especially sorry at all. "We were watching Alara lose to Duke." "I heard about yesterday's spectacle," Nora said, though her eyes crinkled with something like amusement as she looked at Alara. "The whole kitchen was talking about it by supper. Apparently you have made quite an impression." Alara felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I did not mean to cause any talk." "Talk is not always a bad thing," Nora said, ushering the children toward the house. "This place has been too quiet for too long. A little noise does us good." She paused, glancing back over her shoulder. "Keep it the goat, if you like. I think the children need something to look forward to in the mornings." She left before Alara could respond, herding Finn and Wren ahead of her, and Alara stood alone once more with Duke, turning Nora's words over in her mind. Too quiet for too long. She thought again of the king's tired eyes, the guarded set of his shoulders, the way the great house seemed to hold its silence like a held breath. She worked through the rest of the morning alone, and though she made no further progress with Duke, she found she did not mind the solitude nearly as much as she usually did. There was something almost peaceful in the quiet clink of the pail, the low murmur of her own voice, the simple, honest struggle of trying and failing and trying again. It was near midday when she noticed a figure standing at the edge of the garden, half hidden by the hedge, watching. She recognized the tall shape immediately, and her pulse gave an unexpected stutter. "Your Majesty," she said, straightening. "I did not realize I had an audience." Roran stepped fully into view, looking, if possible, even more tired than he had the evening before, dark circles pressing beneath his eyes. "I was told my children spent the morning here instead of at their lessons," he said. "I came to collect them, but it seems Nora has already managed that." "They left some time ago," Ilara said. "I hope they are not in serious trouble on my account." "They are rarely in serious trouble," he said, and there was something dry in his tone that might, in a lighter man, have passed for humor. "Mostly they are simply difficult to locate. Since their mother died, keeping track of 3 children and a kingdom has proven more challenging than either alone." He said it plainly, without self-pity, but Ilara heard the weight beneath the words all the same. "I am sorry for your loss, Your Majesty," she said quietly. "Truly." He inclined his head slightly, an acknowledgement rather than an invitation to continue on the subject. His gaze drifted to the goat pen, to Duke, who was watching the two of them with what Ilara had come to recognize as his particular brand of smug interest. "Still no success, I take it." "None whatsoever," Ilara admitted, "though I have improved my ability to fall without injuring myself, which I consider a meaningful skill." That almost smile appeared again, quicker this time, gone before it could fully form. "My children seem quite taken with you," he said. "Ren has not stopped talking about the goat since yesterday. Milo cried this morning when he was not allowed to come and watch." "They are wonderful children, Your Majesty. I hope I have not overstepped by allowing them to linger here." "You have not," he said, and something in his voice suggested he meant it more than the simple words conveyed. "It has been some time since I have heard them laugh the way they did yesterday." He paused, as though the admission had surprised even himself, and then, seeming to catch himself, straightened and stepped back. "I should not keep you from your work." "You are not keeping me from anything, Your Majesty. Duke has made it quite clear that no amount of my time will change his mind today." This time the almost smile lasted a full second longer before he mastered it. "Then perhaps tomorrow will be kinder to you," he said, and turned to go, leaving Ilara standing once more in the quiet yard, the mist finally beginning to burn away under a pale, rising sun. She watched him walk back toward the great house, his shoulders set with the particular weight of a man who carried too much and shared too little of it, and found herself thinking, with some surprise, that she would very much like to see him smile properly. Not the almost smile, quickly caught and hidden away, but a real one, unguarded and whole. It was a foolish thought, she told herself, tucking it away with the same careful discipline she applied to every dangerous feeling. She was an Omega, working in his goat pen. He was a king, buried under grief and duty. There was no version of the world in which such a thought led anywhere sensible. And yet, as she turned back to Duke, who had chosen that exact moment to knock over the empty pail simply for the pleasure of doing so, she found the thought lingering all the same, warm and stubborn, refusing to be put away entirely. By the end of the first week, Ilara had become something of a fixture in the mornings, a familiar shape by the goat pen that the household had learned to expect. The kitchen staff waved to her as they carried baskets to the market cart. The stable hands offered small nods of respect, the kind reserved for someone who had survived an ordeal they themselves had wisely avoided. Even old Garrick, the estate's oldest and most weathered worker, had taken to watching her mornings with a kind of grudging admiration, though he never came close enough to risk Duke's temper himself. "You're a stubborn one," he told her one morning, leaning on his rake at a safe distance from the pen. "I like that in a person. Goats respect stubbornness. Shame it doesn't always work in your favor." "Thank you, I think," Ilara said, catching her breath after another failed attempt. "I will take stubbornness as a compliment, even if Duke does not seem to share your opinion." Garrick chuckled, a dry, rusty sound, and shuffled off toward the barn, leaving Ilara once more to her ongoing battle. She had begun to notice, over the days, that her failures came a little less often, her successes a little more. She could now coax perhaps a third of a pail from Duke before he grew tired of the arrangement and upended everything in a fit of temper, which was by any measure progress. The children had become a fixture too. Finn arrived most mornings before his lessons, perching on the fence with the seriousness of a small scholar observing an important experiment. Ren rarely missed a single attempt, offering commentary and encouragement with equal enthusiasm. Milo, once Nora relented and allowed him to return, had taken to narrating events to Duke directly, as though the goat might be reasoned with if only addressed properly. "You have to let her win sometimes," Milo informed Duke solemnly one morning, crouched at the fence with his chin propped on his small hands. "It's only fair." Duke, predictably, ignored him entirely. It was on the 8th morning that things began to shift, in a way Alara had not anticipated. She had arrived earlier than usual, the sky still holding on to the last gray edges of dawn, hoping for a few quiet minutes before the children appeared. Instead, she found the king already there, standing at the fence with his arms crossed, watching Duke with an expression of deep and personal suspicion. "Your Majesty," she said, startled, "I did not expect to find you here so early." "Nor did I expect to find myself here," Roran admitted, not taking his eyes off the goat. "I could not sleep. I find myself curious, against my better judgment, whether today will be the day you finally win." "You have chosen an unlucky morning to check," Alara said, setting down her pail. "I feel certain Duke has plans to humiliate me, at least twice before breakfast." "He has humiliated better people than you," Roran said. "I have watched 3 separate stable hands abandon this task entirely. One of them still will not come within 10 feet of the pen." "Then I suppose I should feel honored to be numbered among the humiliated," Alara said, and was rewarded with that quick, almost smile she had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to look forward to each day. She set to work, and this morning, perhaps buoyed by the unfamiliar presence at the fence, or perhaps simply because persistence eventually pays some small dividend, she managed nearly half a pail before Duke grew bored of good behavior and sent the whole effort scattering into the dirt. "That was progress," Roran said, and there was genuine surprise in his voice, as though he had not expected to mean it. "More than I have seen from anyone else who has tried. A hollow victory, Your Majesty, given the current state of my apron." Alara looked down at herself, thoroughly soaked and mud-streaked, and could not help the small laugh that escaped her. "Though I suppose I will take what triumphs I can find." Roran was quiet for a moment, watching her gather herself, retrieve the pail, and begin resetting the stool with the same patient determination she brought to every attempt, successful or not. "Most people," he said slowly, "would have given up after the first fall, certainly after the second." "I have never found giving up to be particularly useful," Alara said, not looking up from her work. "It rarely solves the actual problem. It simply postpones it and adds shame on top." That sounds like the voice of experience. She hesitated, unsure how much of herself to offer a king who, until a week ago, had not known her name. But something about the quiet morning, the mist still clinging low to the grass, the absence of any other listening ears, made the words come easier than they might have otherwise. "I was told, for most of my life, that I was not capable of much," she said. "I was an omega in a pack that valued strength above all else, and I did not have the kind of strength they respected. So I learned, very early, that I had 2 choices. I could accept what they said about me, or I could quietly prove them wrong, one small thing at a time, without ever making a fuss about it. I chose the second path. It has not always been comfortable, but I do not regret it." Roran was silent for a long moment, and when Alara finally glanced up, she found him watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between surprise and something gentler, something almost sad. "Your pack was foolish," he said quietly. "Strength takes more forms than they apparently understood." The simple certainty in his voice caught her entirely off guard, and she found herself without a ready response, which was, for Alara, a rare and disorienting occurrence. "Thank you, Your Majesty," she managed finally. "That is kind of you to say." "It is not kindness," he said. "It is simply true." He seemed to catch himself then, some old wariness reasserting itself, and he straightened, the brief openness in his expression folding back into its usual careful neutrality. "I should return to the house. There is a matter of border reports waiting for my attention, and they will not review themselves." "Of course, Your Majesty." He turned to go, then paused, glancing back at her with something almost like hesitation. "The children," he said, "have been happier this past week than I have seen them in a long while. I wanted you to know that, whatever comes of the goat." Before she could respond, he was already walking away, his tall figure cutting through the morning mist toward the great house, leaving Alara standing at the fence with a strange warmth blooming in her chest that had very little to do with the exertion of her failed attempts. Duke, apparently sensing that her attention had wandered, chose that moment to knock over the stool entirely, and Alara laughed despite herself, the sound carrying out over the quiet yard. The rest of the day passed in its usual rhythm, chores and small tasks filling the hours, until the children returned from their lessons for one final attempt before supper. It was during this evening session that Finn, watching with his usual serious attention, finally asked the question Alara had sensed building in him for days. "Why did you really leave your old pack?" he asked, as she reset the stool for what felt like the 100th time that day. "You said they thought you were weak." "But that's not really why people leave, is it? People leave because something happened." Alara paused, surprised by the perceptiveness of the question coming from someone so young. She glanced at Ren, who had gone quiet too, clearly waiting for the answer with the same careful attention as her brother. "You are very wise for someone so young," Alara said finally. "You are right. It is not the whole reason." She considered how much to say, weighing truth against the discretion she had promised herself she would maintain. "My birth pack believed that Omegas without strong shifting abilities brought weakness into the bloodline. When it became clear that I would never shift the way they expected, they decided it was better for everyone if I found a new home elsewhere. It was not a violent parting, only a cold one, but cold partings can hurt just as much, in their own way." Ren's face had fallen into an expression of genuine distress. "That's horrible. They just sent you away? Because you couldn't do something you can't control?" "It was their loss, I have come to believe," Alara said gently, touched by the fierce indignation in the small girl's voice. "I have found, since leaving, that there is more than one way to be strong, and more than one place to belong. This kingdom has been kinder to me in a week than my old pack was in years." Finn was quiet for a long moment, turning this over with the same seriousness he brought to everything. "Papa says the same thing sometimes," he said eventually, "that there's more than one way to be strong. He says it about Mama, actually. She wasn't the strongest fighter in the pack, but she was the one everyone listened to when things got hard." Alara felt something soften further in her chest at the mention of the late queen, spoken of with such simple, unguarded love by her children. "She sounds like she was a remarkable woman." "She was," Ren said softly. "I don't remember her very well. I was little, but Finn remembers more." "She used to sing," Finn said, his voice quieter now, more private. "Not fancy songs, just simple ones, while she worked. Papa doesn't sing anymore. I don't think he remembers how." The image struck Alara with unexpected force, a picture of a household that had once been full of music and had gone silent, a king who had perhaps forgotten how to make room for small joys amid the weight of his grief and his duties. She thought of the almost smiles she had seen cross his face over the past week, quick and guarded, as though he did not entirely trust himself to let them linger. "Perhaps," she said carefully, "he simply needs a reminder that it is allowed." Neither child answered, but Ren reached over and squeezed Alara's hand with sudden, fierce affection, and Alara found herself blinking back an unexpected sting of emotion, grateful for the fading evening light that hid it from view. They finished the evening's attempts without further success against Duke, but Alara found she did not mind nearly as much as she might have a week ago. Something had shifted in the quiet yard, some invisible boundary crossed, and though she could not have named exactly what it was, she carried the warmth of it with her, long after the children had been called in for supper, and the stars had begun to appear over the darkening estate. The invitation came on a rainy afternoon, delivered not by the king himself, but by Nora, who arrived at the goat pen with an umbrella in one hand, and an expression that suggested she found the entire situation deeply amusing. "The children have requested your presence at supper tonight," Nora announced, holding the umbrella over both of them as Alara toweled mud from her hands. "And when I say requested, I mean they have been asking non-stop since this morning, to the point where I finally went to the king himself just to make it stop." Alara blinked, certain she had misheard. "Supper? With the family?" "With the family," Nora confirmed. I believe Wren specifically threatened to go on a hunger strike if you did not attend, and Milo backed her up, though I suspect he mostly just likes agreeing with his sister. I could not possibly, Elara said, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt a small, treacherous flicker of hope contradicting them. It would not be proper. I am a farmhand. I muck out pens and lose to goats. I do not belong at the king's table. The king seems to disagree, Nora said, and something in her tone made Elara look up sharply. He agreed to it readily enough, more readily than I expected, if I am honest. Elara felt heat rise in her cheeks, uncertain what to do with that piece of information. I have nothing suitable to wear, she said, grasping for any reasonable excuse. I anticipated that objection, Nora said, producing a folded bundle of clean clothing from beneath her cloak, with the satisfied air of someone who had planned 3 steps ahead. This should do well enough. Now hurry along, supper is in an hour, and I imagine 3 very impatient children are already counting the minutes. There was no graceful way to refuse further, and if Elara was honest with herself, she did not entirely want to. She washed and changed in the small room she had been given near the stables, smoothing her hair as best she could, and told herself firmly that this was simply a kindness extended by children who had grown fond of her, nothing more. She repeated this to herself the entire walk to the great house, and found it did very little to calm the nervous flutter in her chest. The dining hall was smaller than she had expected, warmer too, lit by a low fire and a scattering of candles, rather than the grand chandeliers she had imagined a king might favor. Finn and Wren were already seated, both practically vibrating with excitement, while Milo stood on his chair, despite Nora's repeated attempts to convince him to sit properly. At the head of the table, Roran rose slightly as Elara entered, an old courtesy that seemed to surprise even himself. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice carrying a formality that did not quite match the warmth in his eyes. "My children were, as I understand it, quite insistent." "So I was told, Your Majesty," Elara said, taking the seat Wren had clearly saved for her by patting the chair with great enthusiasm. "I hope I am not intruding." "You are not intruding," Roran said simply, and something in the plain honesty of it settled the last of her nerves. Supper was a livelier affair than Elara had anticipated. Wren narrated the entire history of the goat pen battles for her father's benefit, embellishing certain details with the confident flourish of a natural storyteller, while Finn interjected corrections with equal seriousness. Milo, mostly uninterested in the conversation, occupied himself with arranging his vegetables into what he insisted was a very accurate picture of Duke, though it looked, to Elara's eye, considerably more like a lopsided cloud. "And then she fell in the mud again," Wren announced triumphantly, as though this were the crowning achievement of the entire tale, and Duke just stood there looking very pleased with himself. "He does look pleased with himself remarkably often," Roran observed, glancing at Elara with an expression that held more warmth than she had yet seen from him. "I begin to suspect the goat enjoys the attention as much as your daily defeats provide it." "I have come to the same conclusion, Your Majesty," Elara said. "I believe Duke views our entire arrangement as a form of personal entertainment rather than any real threat to his independence." "Then perhaps you ought to try a different strategy," Roran suggested. "Persistence alone has clearly not won the day." "I have considered several strategies," Elara said. "Bribery, patience, quiet singing, stern words. None have succeeded thus far, though I remain hopeful that sheer stubbornness will eventually wear him down." "A reasonable plan," Roran said, and there it was again, that quick, almost smile, though tonight it lingered a moment longer than usual before he caught himself. The conversation drifted easily from there, touching on small, ordinary things, the state of the gardens, a minor dispute among the kitchen staff over the proper way to prepare bread, Wren's insistence that she was ready to begin learning to ride a horse properly, rather than simply being led around on one. Elara found herself relaxing more than she had expected, drawn in by the easy rhythm of a family that, despite its quiet grief, still found room for laughter around the table. It was only near the end of the meal, as Nora began herding the protesting children toward bed, that the conversation turned more serious. Wren, pausing at the door, looked back at her father with sudden solemnity. "Papa, will you come say goodnight properly tonight, not just from the doorway?" Something flickered across Roran's face, quick and complicated, and Elara saw, In that unguarded moment, the shape of a man who had perhaps kept himself at a careful distance from his own children, not from lack of love, but from some deeper exhaustion he did not know how to set down. "I will," he said quietly. "I promise." Ren beamed and disappeared after Nora, and for a moment, the dining hall fell into a comfortable, contemplative silence. Just the two of them, and the low crackle of the fire. "Thank you for tonight," Roran said finally, not quite meeting her eyes. "I have not seen them this happy at a family meal in longer than I care to admit." "They are wonderful company," Elara said. "You should be proud of them." "I am," he said. "Though I fear I have not always shown it as well as I should. There has been so much to manage since Lyra died. The kingdom does not pause its demands, simply because a household is grieving." He paused, seeming to catch himself sharing more than he had intended, and cleared his throat. "Forgive me. You did not come here to listen to a king's burdens." "I do not mind listening, Your Majesty," Elara said gently. "Everyone carries burdens. It does no harm to set them down for a moment, even briefly, even with an unlikely audience such as myself." He studied her for a long moment, something unreadable moving behind his tired eyes. "You are not what I expected. When Nora first told me a new hand had been assigned to the goat pen. What did you expect, Your Majesty? Someone who would last a day, perhaps two, before requesting a transfer to easier work." He allowed himself a small, genuine smile this time, one that reached all the way to his eyes, and transformed his face entirely, softening the guarded lines that usually held it. "I did not expect someone who would still be here a week later, still trying, still making my children laugh in a way I had nearly forgotten they could." Elara's breath caught slightly at the sight of that unguarded smile, warmth spreading through her chest in a way she had not felt in a very long time, if ever. "I do not give up easily, Your Majesty," she said softly. "Not on goats, and not, I think, on the things that matter." "No," he agreed, his gaze holding hers a moment longer than was strictly necessary. "I am beginning to see that." The moment stretched, warm and quiet, before he seemed to remember himself, and rose from the table, the careful distance settling back over him like a familiar cloak. "I should say good night to the children, as promised," he said. "Thank you again, Elara. Truly." It was the first time he had used her name without the formal address of her position attached to it, and the sound of it in his low voice lingered with her long after she had walked back through the rain to the small room by the stables, long after the candles in the dining hall had been extinguished for the night. She lay awake for some time, staring at the dark ceiling, turning the evening over in her mind, and found herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, allowing herself to hope for something more than mere survival. 2 weeks after the dinner that Elara had not stopped thinking about, a rider arrived at the Blackthorn gates bearing a banner she did not recognize, black and silver, marked with the sharp outline of a raven in flight. She was crossing the courtyard with a bundle of feed when she saw the rider dismount, and something in the tense set of the guard's shoulders told her this was no ordinary visit. "Who is that?" she asked Garrick, who had paused his own work to watch, with an expression of deep unease. "Messenger from the Ashgrove pack," Garrick said, lowering his voice as though the words themselves might carry danger. "Alpha Corvin Ashgrove rules the territory east of here. Bad blood between him and our king goes back years, since before the old queen died. Nothing good ever comes wrapped in that banner." Elara felt a small chill settle over her despite the mild afternoon. She had heard whispers of border tensions since arriving, fragments of conversation among the staff that she had not paid close attention to, too consumed with her own small battles against a stubborn goat to worry over matters of kingdom politics. Now, watching the messenger stride toward the great house with an arrogance that seemed to announce itself before he even opened his mouth, she found herself wishing she had listened more carefully. She did not see Roran for the rest of that day, nor the next, and when she finally caught sight of him 3 days later, crossing the courtyard toward the stables, she barely recognized the tension carved into his face. The tired weight he usually carried had sharpened into something harder, more guarded, and when their eyes met briefly across the yard, he offered only a short nod before continuing on his way, his mind clearly elsewhere. Ren, when she came to the pen that afternoon, was subdued in a way Elara had not seen before. She sat on the fence without her usual commentary, watching Alara's attempts with Duke in near silence. "Is everything all right?" Alara asked gently, setting the pail aside after another failed effort. Ren hesitated, glancing back toward the house as though checking whether anyone might overhear. "Papa's been in meetings for days," she said quietly. Finn heard some of the guards talking. They said Alpha Corvin wants the northern borderlands, the ones with the good hunting grounds. He says they belonged to his family before ours, a long time ago, before there even was a Blackthorn kingdom. "And your father does not agree?" "Papa says the lands have been ours for 3 generations, and Corvin only wants them now because he thinks Papa is weak without Mama," Ren said, her small chin trembling slightly with an anger too large for her years. "He's not weak. He's the strongest alpha in the whole kingdom. But Corvin keeps saying things, sending messages, trying to make Papa look bad in front of the other packs." Alara felt something protective and fierce rise in her chest, surprising in its intensity. "Your father is not weak," she said firmly. "I have seen how carefully he carries this whole kingdom, and how gently he carries all of you, even in the middle of it. That is not weakness. That is a different kind of strength altogether, the kind that does not always announce itself with noise." Ren managed a small, grateful smile, though worry still clouded her young face. "I heard Finn say Corvin might come here himself soon, to talk to Papa in person. Finn says that's worse than the messages, because it means Corvin thinks he can win." The words settled uneasily in Alara's stomach, and though she tried to keep her expression calm for Ren's sake, she found herself watching the great house with new attention over the following days, noting the increased number of guards stationed at the gates, the tense murmurs among the staff, the way Roran's shoulders seemed to grow heavier with each passing morning. It was nearly a week later, on a cold, overcast afternoon, that Alpha Corvin Ashgrove arrived in person, and Alara understood immediately why his presence alone seemed to darken the mood of the entire estate. He was tall, nearly matching Roran's height, with pale eyes that swept over everything and everyone with the flat, assessing look of a man perpetually calculating advantage. His retinue filled the courtyard with an unfamiliar energy, sharp and watchful, nothing like the easy, settled rhythm of the Blackthorn household. Alara kept to the goat pen that day, as instructed by Nora, who had come to warn her to stay clear of the main courtyard, while the visiting Alpha remained on the grounds. But even from a distance, she could see the way Corvin's gaze moved across the estate, as though already measuring it for his own, and the sight left an uneasy knot in her stomach that no amount of goat-related distraction could quite loosen. That evening, after the visiting party had been shown to guest quarters and the courtyard had finally quieted, Alara found Roran standing alone, near the garden wall, staring out at nothing in particular, his shoulders set in a rigid line that spoke of exhaustion, held together by sheer will. "Your Majesty," she said softly, not wanting to startle him, "are you well?" He turned, and for a moment, the careful mask he wore slipped just enough for her to see the true weight of what he was carrying, the fear beneath the composure, the grief, still raw, beneath the duty. "Corvin has requested a formal audience tomorrow," he said, his voice low and controlled. "He intends to make his claim on the northern lands official, in front of witnesses from 3 neighboring packs. If I refuse outright, he will call it an act of aggression and use it to rally support against me. If I negotiate, he will see it as weakness and press further." "What will you do?" Alara asked quietly. "I do not know yet," Roran admitted, and the honesty of it, the rare vulnerability, struck her deeply. Lyra always knew what to say in moments like this. She had a gift for finding the words that held a room together, that reminded people why they trusted the crown in the first place. I have never had that gift. I have only ever had strength, and strength alone will not solve this. Alara considered his words carefully before speaking. "I do not know much of politics, Your Majesty, but I know something of proving people wrong when they underestimate you. Alpha Corvin believes you are diminished by grief, easier to push now than you would have been before. Perhaps the answer is not to show him strength in the way he expects, with threats and postured aggression, but strength in the way he does not expect. Show him a kingdom that stands united behind you, not out of fear, but out of genuine loyalty. Show him children who are thriving, a household that has not crumbled despite everything it has endured. Let him see that grief has not broken you, only reshaped you into something he does not know how to measure." Roran was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "You continue to surprise me," he said finally, his voice softer now, some of the rigid tension easing from his shoulders. "I did not come to this garden expecting wisdom. I came expecting only quiet. I apologize for the intrusion, Your Majesty." "Do not apologize," he said quickly, almost too quickly, as though the words had escaped before he could measure them properly. "I find I do not mind the intrusion." "Not from you." The admission hung between them in the cool evening air, heavier with meaning than either of them seemed prepared to acknowledge fully. Elara felt her pulse quicken, some cautious, hopeful thing unfurling in her chest that she did not quite dare to name. "Whatever you decide tomorrow," she said softly, "your children believe in you completely. I have seen it in every word they speak of you. That is not something Alpha Corvin can take from you, no matter how many lands he claims once belonged to his family." Roran's expression softened further, something almost tender moving behind his tired eyes. "Thank you, Elara," he said quietly, "for the counsel, and for reminding me of what actually matters, when I have spent days forgetting." He held her gaze a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and Elara felt the weight of it settle somewhere deep and unguarded within her, before he finally stepped back, the formal distance reasserting itself as duty called him back toward the house, and the difficult night of preparation still ahead of him. She returned to her small room that night, with her thoughts racing, unable to settle, caught between worry for the kingdom she had so recently come to call home, and a warmth she could no longer pretend not to feel, for the tired, guarded king, who had, against all her careful expectations, begun to matter to her a great deal more than she had ever intended to allow. Tomorrow would bring the formal audience, the watching eyes of neighboring packs, the sharp calculating gaze of Alpha Corvin Ashgrove, waiting to find weakness wherever he could press it. Elara did not know what the outcome would be. But she knew, lying awake in the darkness, that she wanted very badly for Roran to walk out of that hall standing taller than he had walked in, and she found herself hoping, with a fierceness that surprised her, that whatever came next would not be the thing that finally broke him. The great hall had been transformed overnight into something Elara barely recognized, banners raised, long tables cleared away to make room for the gathered witnesses from 3 neighboring packs, each delegation watching the proceedings with the careful, hungry attention of those eager to see which way the balance of power might tip. Elara had not been invited, of course. An Omega farmhand had no place among alphas and diplomats, but Nora had quietly arranged for her to stand near the servants' entrance at the rear of the hall, close enough to see, distant enough not to be noticed. Alpha Corvin Ashgrove stood near the center of the hall, flanked by 2 broad-shouldered lieutenants, his pale eyes gleaming with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won before a single word had been spoken. He wore his authority like a performance, every gesture calculated for the watching audience, and Elara felt her stomach tighten with dislike at the sight of him. Roran entered from the opposite side, and Alara's breath caught at the sight of him. Gone was the tired, guarded man she had spoken with in the garden the night before. In his place stood a king, tall and composed, his expression unreadable, his bearing radiating a quiet, unshakable authority that needed no performance to prove itself. Beside him, to Alara's surprise, walked Finn, dressed in formal attire, his young face set with the same careful seriousness his father wore, and behind them, Ren and Milo, hand in hand with Nora, took their places at the edge of the hall where the family traditionally stood for important occasions. "Alpha Corvin," Roran said, his voice carrying easily across the hall without need for volume. "You have traveled far to make your claim. I will hear it, as is proper between neighboring packs." Corvin's smile was thin, practiced. "Your Majesty," he said, the title carrying the faintest edge of mockery, "I come only to reclaim what history has always recognized as Ashgrove land. The Northern Territories were held by my ancestors 3 generations before your family claimed them through means that, shall we say, history remembers differently than your court historians would prefer." A murmur rippled through the watching delegations, and Elara felt her hands curl into fists at her sides, frustrated at her own helplessness to do anything but watch. "History," Roran said calmly, "remembers many things differently depending on who tells it. I will not waste this gathering, relitigating claims 3 generations old. I will speak instead to what is true today. The Northern Territories have been protected, cultivated, and shared fairly among the packs who depend on them for 3 generations. My father honored those agreements. I have honored them. The families who farm that land, who hunt those grounds, who have built their lives upon that soil, did not ask to be caught between old grudges, dressed up as history. Corvin's smile flickered, just slightly. Sentiment does not settle land disputes, Your Majesty. No, Roran agreed. But it does reveal something about a man's true intentions. You do not want those lands for the families who live there. You want them because you believe my kingdom is weakened, and you see an opportunity to press an advantage while I am, in your estimation, distracted by grief. His voice remained level, unhurried, but something in it carried a weight that silenced the murmuring hall entirely. You are wrong, Alpha Corvin. I have grieved, yes. I will likely grieve for the rest of my life, in quiet moments, when the weight of what I have lost catches up with me. But grief has not weakened this kingdom. It has clarified, for me, exactly what matters, and what I am prepared to protect. He turned slightly, gesturing toward his children, standing tall and steady at the edge of the hall. My children have watched me carry this kingdom through its hardest years, and they have not once doubted that I would continue to carry it. My people have watched the same, and their loyalty has not wavered. You mistake quiet strength for weakness, because you have never had to learn the difference. I will not surrender lands that belong to families who trust this crown, simply because you have convinced yourself that sorrow makes a king easy to topple. The silence that followed was absolute, every eye in the hall fixed on the 2 alphas, waiting to see how Corvin would respond to words that had clearly landed harder than he expected. Alara found she was holding her breath, her heart pounding with a fierce, unexpected pride that startled her with its intensity. Corvin's composure cracked, just slightly, a flicker of genuine anger passing behind his pale eyes before he mastered it. This is not finished, he said finally, his voice tighter than before. No, Roran agreed evenly. It is not. But it will be settled through proper channels, through the Council of Packs, through evidence and precedent, not through intimidation staged for an audience. You are welcome to bring your claim before the full council, Alpha Corvin. I will meet you there, as I have met you here, without fear. The watching delegations exchanged glances, and Alara, even from her distant vantage point, could see the shift in the room, the subtle recalculation happening behind a dozen careful expressions. Corvin had come expecting to find weakness, and he had left, instead, having witnessed something else entirely. A king who had turned his grief into steadiness rather than fracture. Corvin offered a stiff, shallow bow, more insult than respect, and turned to gather his retinue, his earlier confidence visibly shaken. As he passed near the servant's entrance on his way out, his pale eyes swept briefly across the gathered staff, pausing, for just a moment, on Alara. Something flickered in his expression, a flash of recognition that sent an unexpected chill down her spine, though she could not place why. He said nothing, moving past without pause, but the moment lingered with her long after he and his retinue had disappeared through the great doors and out into the courtyard beyond. The hall erupted into low, urgent conversation the moment the doors closed, the neighboring delegations already discussing what they had witnessed, and Alara watched as Roran finally allowed his shoulders to drop, just slightly, the enormous effort of the performance catching up with him, now that the audience he needed to convince had gone. Finn moved to his side immediately, and Roran rested a hand briefly on his son's shoulder, something quiet and grateful passing between them. It was several hours later, once the visiting delegations had been seen off, and the hall returned to its ordinary quiet, that Alara found herself once again near the garden wall, drawn there by some instinct she did not fully examine. Roran arrived not long after, looking drained but lighter than she had seen him in days, the crushing weight of the morning's confrontation finally beginning to ease from his shoulders. You did not have to come find me, he said, though there was no complaint in it, only something warm and slightly bemused. I wanted to see how you fared, Alara said. From what little I witnessed, I believe you fared remarkably well, Your Majesty. I nearly did not, he admitted quietly. Standing in that hall, I kept thinking of what you told me in this very garden last night. Show him strength he does not expect. I do not know that I would have found the right words without that reminder. I only offered an observation, Your Majesty. You were the one who stood in that hall and delivered it. Perhaps, he said, but I have found, these past weeks, that I think more clearly after speaking with you than I have in longer than I can remember. That is not a small thing, Ilara. I hope you understand how much it has come to mean to me." The quiet sincerity in his voice left her without a ready reply, her heart beating a little too fast in her chest, as he studied her in the fading evening light, something unguarded and warm passing between them that neither seemed quite ready to name aloud. But before either of them could speak further, a chill wind stirred through the garden, and Ilara found her thoughts returning, unbidden, to the flash of recognition she had glimpsed in Corvin's pale eyes as he passed the servants' entrance. She said nothing of it to Roran that evening, uncertain what it meant, unwilling to cast a shadow over a moment of hard-won peace. But the unease lingered with her all the same, a small, cold thread woven quietly through the warmth of the day's victory, and she found herself wondering, as she walked back toward her small room beneath a darkening sky, whether Alpha Corvin Ashgrove had recognized something in her that she had spent years trying very hard to keep hidden. The unease Ilara had carried since the audience did not fade as the days passed. If anything, it settled deeper, a quiet, persistent hum, beneath the ordinary rhythm of her mornings with Duke and her afternoons with the children. She told herself repeatedly that she was imagining significance where none existed, that a stranger's passing glance meant nothing at all. But sleep came less easily, and she found herself watching the estate gates with a wariness she could not quite shake. It was Nora who finally noticed something was wrong, catching Ilara staring blankly at a half-filled pail one morning, instead of attending to her usual battle with Duke. "You have not been yourself these past few days," Nora observed, settling onto the fence beside her with the easy familiarity of someone who had decided, without asking permission, that Ilara's well-being was now partly her concern, ever since that dreadful man came through with his banners and his sneering lieutenants. Ilara hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something in Nora's steady, patient expression convinced her the older woman would not judge whatever she said next. "When Alpha Corvin was leaving the hall," she said slowly, "he looked at me, not simply looked, but recognized something. I do not know what or why, but the feeling has not left me since." Nora's expression sharpened with interest rather than dismissal. "You have not told the king this?" "I did not want to burden him further, not after everything he had just faced," Ilara admitted. "And I was not certain it meant anything at all. Perhaps I imagined it." "You do not strike me as someone prone to imagining things, Ilara," Nora said gently. "Tell me honestly, is there something in your past that a man like Corvin might have reason to recognize?" Ilara was quiet for a long moment, turning the question over with more honesty than she had allowed herself in years. "My birth pack told me I was cast out because I could not shift properly, because I was weak, unsuited to carry forward a strong bloodline," she said finally. "I believed it for a long time. But there were things about my leaving that never quite made sense to me. My mother wept the night I left, more than seemed warranted for someone simply too weak to matter, and my father, before he died, once told me, in a moment of rare openness, that I carried something the pack elders feared rather than pitied. He would not explain further. He died not long after, and I never learned what he meant." Nora's brow furrowed with thoughtful concern. "Feared rather than pitied," she repeated slowly. "That is a very different story than the one you were given." "I have wondered, over the years, whether there was truth in his words," Ilara admitted. "But I never had the means or the courage to investigate further. It seemed safer to accept the simpler explanation and move forward with my life." "Perhaps it is time to be less safe and more curious," Nora said, though not unkindly. "I do not like the idea of a man like Corvin recognizing something about you that even you do not fully understand. Men like that do not deal in coincidence. If he saw something worth noting, he will act on it eventually, in whatever way benefits him most." The conversation left Ilara more unsettled than before, and it was with this unresolved worry sitting heavy in her chest that she found herself, later that same evening, once again in Roran's company, this time in the small library he favored for quiet work after the children had gone to bed. He had invited her, somewhat hesitantly, to share a cup of tea after supper, an invitation that had become, over recent weeks, a quietly cherished routine, neither of them acknowledged aloud as anything more than simple friendship, though the warmth between them had grown steadily harder to disguise as merely that. "You seem troubled tonight," Roran observed, setting aside the report he had been reviewing to study her more closely. Has something happened? Alara considered deflecting, as she had with Nora, but found she did not want to carry this weight alone any longer. Not from him. I believe Alpha Corvin recognized something about me when he passed through the hall, she said quietly, and proceeded to share what she had told Nora, the strange circumstances of her exile, her father's cryptic words, the fear she could not quite name but could not shake either. Roran listened without interruption, his expression growing more serious with each detail, until finally he set down his tea entirely and leaned forward, his full attention fixed on her. Corvin does not deal in idle curiosity, he said, echoing Nora's words with grim certainty. If he recognized something in you, it is because it matters to him in some way. I do not like this, Alara. I do not like it at all. I do not know what I am, if I am anything at all beyond what my pack told me, Alara said, frustration and old grief threading through her voice. I have spent years accepting a story that never fully made sense, because the alternative felt too dangerous to pursue. Then perhaps it is time to pursue it, Roran said gently. I have scholars in this kingdom, records of old bloodlines and rare gifts among our people, dating back generations. If your father's words meant something, we may be able to find answers here, safely, without exposing you to further risk. The offer, so simply and readily given, struck Alara deeply. You would do that? Spend your resources and your scholar's time investigating the history of a farmhand who cannot even successfully milk a goat. Something warm and unguarded crossed Roran's face, the careful distance he usually maintained slipping further than she had ever seen it slip before. Alara, he said quietly, you have stopped being simply a farmhand to me, some weeks ago now, if you have not already noticed. I would do this because I care what happens to you, and because I do not trust a man like Corvin to hold information about you without eventually using it against you, or against this kingdom, or both. The admission hung in the quiet library between them, heavy with meaning neither had spoken aloud until now. Alara felt her heart racing, uncertain whether to retreat to safer, more careful ground, or to meet the honesty he had offered with equal honesty of her own. I have tried very hard, she admitted softly, not to feel what I have begun to feel these past weeks. It did not seem wise, or fair to either of us, given everything you carry. And have you succeeded? Roran asked, his voice low, his gaze steady, and searching on hers. No, Alara said simply. I have not succeeded at all. The silence that followed was different from any that had passed between them before, charged with something neither of them seemed willing to break carelessly. Roran rose slowly from his chair and crossed the small distance between them, stopping close enough that Alara could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the warmth radiating from him in the cool evening air. I have not allowed myself to feel much of anything since Lyra died, he said quietly. I told myself it was for the children, that I needed to remain steady and unmoved for their sake. But you have made steadiness feel less like a burden, and more like something I might actually choose, rather than something I am simply enduring. I do not know what that means, precisely, or where it leads, but I do not want to pretend any longer that it is nothing. Alara's breath caught, her heart pounding loud enough that she was certain he must hear it in the quiet room. Roran, she said softly, using his name without title for the first time, testing the weight of it. I do not know what I am, or what danger my past might bring to your door. It would be safer for you, and for your children, if I simply left before Corvin's interest becomes something more than a passing glance. I do not want you to be safer by leaving, Roran said, his voice rough, with an honesty that undid her carefully maintained composure entirely. I want you to stay, and I want to face whatever danger comes together, rather than watch you disappear into the night, because you believe your presence here is only a burden. You are not a burden, Alara. You have brought more light into this house in a few short weeks than I believed possible after everything we lost. The distance between them had narrowed further, without either quite noticing, and for a long, suspended moment, Alara believed he might close it entirely. But a sharp knock at the library door broke the spell, before either of them could act on the pull drawing them together, and they stepped apart quickly as Nora entered, her expression tight with urgency that immediately banished the warmth from the room. Your Majesty, Nora said, breathless from hurrying. A rider has just arrived from the northern border. There has been an incursion. Ashgrove forces have crossed into the territories under cover of darkness, and the border guard is requesting immediate reinforcement. Roran's expression transformed instantly, the warmth of moments ago replaced by the hard, focused resolve of a king facing crisis. "Assemble the guard captains," he said, already moving toward the door. "I will be there within the hour." He paused only briefly at the threshold, glancing back at Alara with an expression that carried both apology and promise in equal measure. "This conversation is not finished," he said quietly. "I intend to return to it, when this crisis has passed." Then he was gone, his footsteps echoing quickly down the corridor, leaving Alara alone in the library with her racing heart, her unanswered questions about her own hidden nature, and a fresh, sharper fear now settling over everything. The unmistakable sense that whatever Corvin had recognized in her, whatever old danger her exile had truly been meant to hide, was no longer simply a quiet mystery to be solved at leisure. It had arrived, uninvited and urgent, at the very gates of the kingdom she had, against every careful instinct she once held, allowed herself to call home. The estate fell into a tense, watchful quiet after Roran departed with a company of guards before dawn, riding hard for the northern border, where the reported incursion had thrown the outlying villages into panic. Alara had not slept at all that night, standing at her window long after the sound of hooves had faded into the darkness, worry coiling tight in her chest for a man she had, only hours before, finally admitted to caring for deeply. The children felt his absence keenly. Finn, usually so composed, grew quiet and withdrawn, spending long hours staring out toward the northern road, as though he might will his father's safe return through sheer concentration. Ren asked a dozen anxious questions Alara could not fully answer, and Milo, sensing the shift in mood even if he did not understand its cause, clung more tightly than usual to Nora's skirts, refusing to be set down for more than a few minutes at a time. Ren asked on the second morning, appearing at the goat pen not for the usual entertainment of watching Alara battle Duke, but simply for the comfort of familiar company. "Your father is the strongest alpha in this kingdom," Alara said, kneeling to meet the girl's worried eyes directly. "I have seen him stand firm against a man who wanted very badly to unsettle him, and I have seen him remain unshaken. He will handle this the same way, with steadiness and care for his people." "Corvin started this, didn't he?" Finn said, arriving in time to catch the tail end of the conversation, his young voice tight with an anger that seemed too old for his years. "He couldn't win with words in the hall, so now he's trying to win with soldiers instead." "It appears that way," Alara admitted, unwilling to lie to a child, perceptive enough to see through any comforting fiction she might have offered instead. "But your father has faced difficult things before, and he has never let this kingdom fall. I do not believe he will let it fall now." Despite her steady words to the children, Alara's own worry only deepened as the days passed without further news, each hour stretching long and uncertain. She threw herself into her usual routines, if only to keep her hands and mind occupied, continuing her ongoing, largely unsuccessful campaign against Duke each morning, though even the goat seemed to sense the shift in mood, behaving with slightly less mischief than usual, as though granting her a small mercy amid the greater uncertainty hanging over the estate. It was on the third evening, as Alara crossed the darkened courtyard toward the kitchens, that she first noticed something wrong. A figure moved along the edge of the stable, too careful in its movements to be one of the regular staff going about ordinary evening chores. She paused, pressing herself into the shadow of the well, watching as the figure paused near the side entrance, used mainly by servants, glancing around with obvious caution before slipping inside. Her heart pounding, Alara followed at a careful distance, some old instinct sharpening her senses in a way she had not experienced since her earliest days after leaving her birth pack, when survival alone had demanded a heightened wariness of every shadow. She trailed the figure through the narrow servants' corridor, staying low, staying quiet, until she saw him pause outside the door to the children's private wing, testing the handle with a slow, deliberate care that left no doubt about his intentions. "Can I help you find something?" Alara asked sharply, stepping fully into the corridor. The man startled, spinning to face her, and in the dim light of a single wall lantern, she recognized the insignia stitched into his collar, the same black and silver raven that had marked Corvin's retinue during their visit weeks before. He had stayed behind, she realized with a cold jolt, embedded among the estate's temporary staff hired to manage the extra work created by the visiting delegation, unnoticed and unremarked upon in the chaos of preparation and departure. "Wrong wing," the man said, forcing a casualness that did not reach his eyes. "I must have taken a wrong turn." "You have taken several wrong turns, it seems," Alara said, keeping her voice level despite the racing of her pulse, "given that this corridor leads only to the children's private quarters, and nowhere else useful to a member of the kitchen staff." The man's expression shifted, the false casualness dropping away entirely, replaced by something colder and more calculating. "You should not have followed me," he said quietly, and before Alara could react, he lunged. She sidestepped instinctively, some old training surfacing from depths she had not accessed in years, and the man's outstretched hand closed only on empty air, where she had stood a heartbeat before. He recovered quickly, turning to face her fully now, and Alara realized with sudden clarity that she was, for the first time since arriving at the Blackthorn estate, entirely on her own, against a threat that meant real harm. "You will not touch those children," she said, backing toward the wall, positioning herself between the intruder and the door to the children's wing, her voice steadier than she felt. "Whatever Corvin sent you here to do, it ends now." The man's laugh was low and unpleasant. "Corvin was right about you then," he said. "He said there was something familiar in your face, something worth investigating. I did not believe him until now. You move like someone trained for exactly this kind of confrontation, not like any farmhand I have ever encountered." Alara said nothing, her mind racing through the narrow options available to her, aware that every second spent talking was a second the man might use to close the distance between them. When he lunged again, she was ready this time, twisting away and driving her elbow hard into his side, with a force that surprised even herself, sending him staggering back against the corridor wall with a pained grunt. "Guards," she shouted, her voice carrying with a strength she had not known she possessed. "Intruder in the servants' corridor, near the children's wing." The man recovered quickly despite her strike, lunging a third time with a knife, now glinting in his hand, and Alara felt real fear seize her chest, not for herself, but for the children sleeping just beyond the door she was determined to protect. She caught his wrist as the blade descended, twisting with a strength born of pure, desperate instinct, and they grappled together in the narrow corridor, until the pounding of running feet finally announced the arrival of the estate guard, drawn by her shouts. The intruder was subdued quickly once the guards arrived, disarmed and restrained despite his continued struggling, but Alara remained pressed against the wall for a long moment afterward, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her hands trembling now that the immediate danger had passed. Nora arrived moments later, having been woken by the commotion, and rushed to Alara's side with obvious alarm. "You are hurt," Nora said, taking in the scrape along Alara's arm, where the knife had grazed her during the struggle. "It is only shallow," Alara said, though her voice shook more than she wanted it to. "He was after the children, Nora. He was testing the door to their wing when I found him." Nora's face went pale with the realization of how close disaster had come, and she pulled Alara into a fierce, grateful embrace. "Thank the stars you were here," she said. "Thank the stars you noticed him at all." The children, roused by the noise despite everyone's efforts to keep them undisturbed, appeared at the end of the corridor moments later, Finn in the lead with a fierce, protective expression that mirrored his father's, Ren close behind him clutching Milo's hand tightly. "What happened?" Finn demanded, his eyes moving between the restrained intruder and Alara's scraped arm with dawning, frightened understanding. "Everyone is safe," Alara assured them, kneeling, despite her trembling hands, to gather all three children close, Milo immediately burying his face against her shoulder. "That is what matters. You are all safe." But even as she spoke the reassuring words, Alara's mind was already racing ahead, toward the unsettling certainty that this had been no random attempt, that Corvin had sent this man specifically, that whatever recognition had flickered in his pale eyes weeks ago had already set something dangerous into motion. The border incursion, she realized with growing dread, might not have been the true attack at all, but simply a calculated distraction, drawing Roran and his strongest guards away from the one place Corvin truly intended to strike. As the guards led the intruder away for questioning, and Nora began the difficult task of settling the frightened children back toward sleep, Ilara remained standing in the quiet corridor, her scraped arm throbbing, her thoughts consumed by a single, urgent certainty. Whatever came next, whatever answers still waited to be uncovered about her own hidden past and the fear that had driven her exile so many years ago, she would not allow it to cost this family the safety they had only just begun, together, to rebuild. Roran returned 2 days later, riding through the gates at midday, with the dust of hard travel still clinging to him, and the moment he heard what had happened in his absence, his face drained of color, in a way Ilara had never seen. He found her in the small sitting room where she had been keeping watch over the children, and before she could rise properly to greet him, he had crossed the room and pulled her into his arms, holding her with a fierce, trembling intensity that spoke louder than any words could have managed. "I should never have left," he said into her hair, his voice rough with a fear he made no effort to hide now that the danger had passed. "If anything had happened to you, or to them, while I was gone chasing a distraction I did not even recognize as one." "Nothing happened," Ilara said gently, though she did not pull away from his embrace, allowing herself, for once, the simple comfort of being held. "We are all safe, that is what matters now." He drew back just enough to study her face, his eyes moving to the bandaged scrape on her arm, with a wince of guilt and gratitude tangled together. "You fought him off, alone, with nothing but instinct and courage." He shook his head slowly, something like wonder mixing with the lingering fear in his expression. "You saved my children, Ilara. I do not know how I will ever repay that." "You owe me nothing," she said firmly. "I would have done it regardless of anything between us. But I will admit, Roran, that the man who attacked me recognized something in my movements that even I do not fully understand. He said Corvin had suspected something familiar about me, worth investigating. I fear the border incursion was never the true attack. I fear it was only meant to draw you away." Roran's expression hardened with grim understanding, and he was already moving toward the door before she finished speaking, calling for his guard captain and his scholars in the same breath, determined now to uncover exactly what danger had followed Ilara to his doorstep, and why. The answers, when they finally came 2 days later, arrived not through the estate's own limited records but through an unexpected messenger, an elderly scholar from a distant archive that Roran's inquiries had reached, carrying documents so old their edges had begun to crumble at the corners. Ilara sat beside Roran in the library as the scholar carefully unfolded the brittle pages, her heart pounding with an anticipation she had carried, in some quiet corner of herself, for her entire life. "Your bloodline," the scholar said slowly, tracing a faded line of old script with a careful, reverent finger, "descends from a lineage nearly lost to history, one that predates most of the packs currently ruling these territories. Those who carried it were known, in the old records, as guardians, omegas who did not shift in the manner most packs expect, because their true gift lay elsewhere entirely, in a rare and formidable strength of instinct and protection that awakened only in moments of genuine crisis, when those they loved faced true danger." Ilara felt the room tilt slightly around her, the scholar's words settling into place like pieces of a puzzle she had carried, unfinished, for her entire life. "That is why I never shifted the way my pack expected," she said slowly, understanding dawning with a mixture of relief and old grief for years spent believing herself simply broken. "It was never weakness, it was something else entirely, something they did not understand, and so they called it a flaw instead." "Precisely," the scholar confirmed. "And it appears, from these records, that certain older packs, including the ancestors of the Ashgrove line, once viewed such guardians with suspicion bordering on fear, believing them capable of overturning the natural order of alpha dominance, if their gift were ever fully awakened, and turned against them. It seems your birth pack may have exiled you not out of contempt for weakness, but out of fear of a strength they did not know how to control or contain." Roran had gone very still beside her, his gaze fixed on Ilara with an expression of dawning, fierce protectiveness. "This is why Corvin recognized you," he said quietly. "He knows the old records. He understood exactly what you might become, and he sent that man to eliminate the threat before it could ever fully awaken." The revelation settled heavy and strange over Ilara. Years of quiet self-doubt, reorganizing themselves around this new, unexpected truth. She had spent so long believing herself simply lesser, simply flawed, and now found herself instead standing at the edge of something she barely understood, a strength she had never been taught to recognize, let alone wield. She did not have long to sit with the weight of this revelation before it was tested in the most direct way imaginable. That very night, as the household settled into an uneasy sleep still shadowed by the earlier attack, the peace of the estate shattered entirely when the alarm bell began ringing wildly from the gatehouse, its urgent clanging cutting through the darkness like a scream. Alara was on her feet instantly, some instinct sharper and surer than anything she had ever felt before propelling her out of her room and toward the children's wing, before conscious thought had even fully caught up with her actions. She arrived to find Nora already there, herding a frightened, sleepy Milo and Wren toward the safe room built into the estate's oldest wall, while Finn stood at the doorway, refusing to move without confirmation that his father was safe. "Where is the king?" Alara demanded, catching Finn's arm gently but firmly. "He went to the gate when the alarm sounded," Finn said, his young voice tight with fear he was trying valiantly to master. "There are soldiers, Alara. Corvin's soldiers. They came through the eastern wall while everyone was distracted by the front gates." The realization struck Alara with sudden, terrible clarity. A second coordinated distraction, the alarm at the front drawing attention and guards away from a quieter, more dangerous breach elsewhere. She could already hear the distant sounds of clashing steel and shouted commands drifting from the eastern side of the estate, closer now than she liked, moving steadily toward the very wing where the children stood. "Get Wren and Milo into the safe room," Alara told Nora urgently. "Finn, you as well." "I am not leaving you to face them alone," Finn said, drawing himself up with a stubborn, fierce determination that so closely mirrored his father's that Alara's heart ached even amid her rising fear. "You will do exactly as I ask," Alara said firmly, kneeling to meet his eyes directly, "because your father needs to know all three of you are safe, and because I need to know it too, so that I can do what must be done without fear clouding every decision I make. Please, Finn, trust me." Something in her voice, some new certainty she had not possessed even hours before, seemed to reach him, and he nodded reluctantly, allowing Nora to guide him toward the safe room alongside his siblings. Alara waited only long enough to see the heavy door sealed behind them, before turning toward the sounds of fighting now drawing dangerously close, her heart pounding, every instinct she had spent a lifetime suppressing, suddenly rising to the surface with a clarity that felt less like panic and more like awakening. The corridor outside the children's wing filled moments later with 3 armed intruders, Ashgrove soldiers who had clearly been given specific instructions about which part of the estate to target, and Alara understood in that instant, with cold certainty, exactly what Corvin had truly sent them to accomplish. Not conquest, not territory. Removal of the very heirs who represented Roran's strength and legacy, struck at the moment his defenses were split and stretched thinnest. "You will not pass this door," Alara said, positioning herself squarely in the corridor between the soldiers and the sealed safe room, her voice steadier and stronger than she had ever heard it. The lead soldier laughed, unimpressed by the sight of a single unarmed woman standing between him and his objective. "Step aside," he said, "and you may yet live through tonight." Something shifted inside Alara then, some long-dormant strength finally answering a call it had waited her entire life to receive. It was not a physical transformation, not the kind of shift her old pack had once mocked her for lacking, but something deeper, an awakening of instinct and power that settled into her limbs with startling fierce clarity. When the first soldier lunged, she moved with a speed and precision that surprised even herself, disarming him with a single fluid motion and sending him crashing into the corridor wall before the others had even fully registered what had happened. The fight that followed was brief but fierce, Alara moving through the narrow corridor with a controlled, protective ferocity that seemed to draw directly from the very fear and love she carried for the children sealed safely behind her, and it was in the midst of this fight, as she disarmed the second soldier and turned to face the third, that Roran arrived, having fought his way from the eastern breach the moment word reached him of the second attack. He froze for one stunned heartbeat at the sight before him, his Omega standing fierce and unyielding between armed soldiers and his children's sealed door, moving with a strength and grace that spoke of an awakening he had not witnessed but somehow, in some quiet corner of his heart, had always sensed waiting within her. Then he was moving too, closing the remaining distance in seconds, and together they subdued the final intruder, the corridor falling silent, except for their ragged breathing, and the muffled, frightened sounds of the children still sealed safely behind the heavy door. "Alara," Roran said, his voice raw with a dozen emotions at once, relief and awe and fierce protective love all tangled together as he reached for her, checking for injury with trembling, careful hands. "You are the guardian the old scholar spoke of. You truly are." "I am whatever I need to be," Alara said, breathless but steady, "to keep this family safe." Roran pulled her close then, heedless of the soldiers still groaning on the corridor floor, heedless of anything except the overwhelming truth of what he had just witnessed, and what it meant. "I love you," he said quietly, fiercely, the words finally spoken aloud, after weeks of careful restraint. "I do not know when it happened exactly, only that it has, completely, and without reservation, and I am done pretending otherwise." "I love you too," Alara answered, her own restraint finally giving way entirely. The truth she had guarded so carefully, finally spoken plainly into the quiet, dangerous night. "I have for some time now." Behind them, the safe room door creaked open, despite Nora's protests, and three small, frightened faces peered out into the corridor, taking in the sight of their father, and Alara, standing together, amid the aftermath of battle, safe and whole, and finally, unmistakably, together. The days that followed the attack passed in a blur of investigation, council summons, and careful diplomacy, as Roran moved swiftly to expose Corvin's role in the coordinated assault before the full gathering of neighboring packs. The captured soldiers, faced with the full weight of their crimes, offered testimony that left little room for doubt or denial, and the scholar's old records, once presented before the council, transformed what might have been dismissed as unfounded accusation into undeniable, documented truth. Alpha Corvin Ashgrove, confronted with evidence of an attack aimed directly at innocent children under the guise of a border dispute, found himself abandoned swiftly by the very allies he had hoped to rally against Roran. No pack, however sympathetic to old territorial grievances, wished to be associated with an alpha who had ordered violence against children to further his own ambitions. Within a fortnight, Corvin's own council stripped him of much of his authority, and the threat that had shadowed the Blackthorn Kingdom for weeks finally dissolved, not through further conflict, but through the simple, undeniable weight of truth laid bare before those whose respect he had once commanded. Alara watched these events unfold, with a strange, quiet sense of closure. The fear that had once driven her exile finally understood, and, in understanding, finally released. The scholar remained at the estate for several additional weeks, helping her piece together more of her family's forgotten history, and Alara found, with each new fragment uncovered, a growing sense of peace, with a heritage she had once believed only marked her as broken. "Your father knew," the scholar told her gently, near the end of his research. "He recognized what you carried, even without full understanding of the old records himself. His tears the night you left were not for a daughter he believed too weak to matter, but for a daughter he feared he could no longer protect from a pack too frightened of what she might become." The knowledge settled something long unsettled within Alara, a grief she had carried for years, finally softening into something gentler, something closer to gratitude for a father who had, in his own limited and fearful way, loved her more than she had ever understood. Life at the Blackthorn estate slowly returned to its ordinary rhythms in the weeks that followed, though everything felt subtly, wonderfully different now that the careful distance between Alara and Roran had finally dissolved entirely. The children, delighted beyond measure to learn that Alara would be staying permanently, no longer as a farmhand tending goats, but as someone woven fully and openly into the fabric of their family, greeted the news with an enthusiasm that filled the great house with more laughter than it had known in years. "Does this mean you don't have to milk Duke anymore?" Ren asked one morning, watching with obvious hope as Alara approached the goat pen out of what had become, by this point, sheer stubborn habit, rather than any remaining obligation. "I believe I have earned the right to retire from that particular battle," Alara said, though something in her smile suggested she was not quite ready to fully surrender the fight. "But I find I have grown rather fond of Duke, despite everything. I believe I shall visit him regardless, if only to remind him that I never actually gave up." "He still hasn't let you win," Finn pointed out, though his tone had lost the wary seriousness of earlier weeks. replaced now by an easy warmth that came naturally when speaking with someone he had come to trust completely. "No," Elara agreed, laughing. "He has not. Perhaps some battles are meant to continue indefinitely, simply for the joy of the effort rather than any final victory." It was on a quiet afternoon, several months after the attack, that Roran finally found the moment he had been quietly planning for weeks, gathering the children together in the garden, where so much of their story together had first taken root. Elara arrived to find all three of them waiting with barely contained excitement, Ren practically vibrating with the effort of keeping a secret, Milo grinning without any real understanding of what the fuss was about beyond the obvious joy radiating from his siblings. "What is all this?" Elara asked, glancing between the children's eager faces and Roran's uncharacteristically nervous expression. "We have something to ask you," Roran said, and then, with a warmth and vulnerability that still, even now, caught her breath every time she witnessed it, he knelt before her in the very garden where they had first spoken honestly to one another, holding out a ring that caught the afternoon light with quiet, understated elegance. "Elara," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly moving beneath it, "you arrived at this estate a stranger, carrying nothing but a story you believed to be true, and a determination to prove yourself against every doubt the world had placed upon you. You have since become the very heart of this family, the strength my children lean upon, the peace I did not believe I would ever find again after loss I thought unrecoverable. I do not simply want you to stay. I want you to stay as my wife, as their mother in every way that matters, as the queen this kingdom needs and deserves. Will you do me that honor?" Elara felt tears rise, warm and unashamed, as she looked around at the faces surrounding her, Finn's careful composure finally breaking into open, delighted emotion, Ren already crying happy tears of her own, Milo simply beaming with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a small child who understood only that something wonderful was happening to people he loved. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with feeling. "Yes, completely, without any hesitation at all." The children's cheers echoed across the garden, with the same fierce, joyful enthusiasm they had once offered her during her earliest, clumsiest attempts to milk a stubborn goat, and Elara found herself struck by the beautiful symmetry of it, that the same small voices which had cheered her through failure after failure in that muddy pen were now cheering her into a future she had never dared to imagine for herself. Roran rose and pulled her close, sealing the promise with a kiss that spoke of everything they had built together since that first muddy, chaotic afternoon, patient and hard-won, and entirely worth every difficult step that had led them here. Behind them, Duke, who had somehow wandered free of his pen yet again and made his way into the garden uninvited, let out a loud, indignant bleat, as though offended at being excluded from such an important family occasion. "Even Duke approves," Ren announced through her happy tears, and the whole family dissolved into laughter, warm and unguarded, the kind of sound that filled a house rather than simply echoing through it. In the months that followed, the wedding was celebrated not with the cold formality Elara had once feared such occasions demanded, but with genuine warmth, the entire estate gathering together to honor a king who had finally found his way back to joy, and an Omega who had finally learned that the strength she carried had never been a flaw to hide, but a gift simply waiting for the right family to recognize and cherish it fully. Duke, against all reasonable expectation, was given a place of honor near the garden during the ceremony, tethered at a respectful distance and behaving, for one single remarkable day, with something almost resembling dignity. Elara liked to think, in the years that followed, that even the stubborn old goat understood, in whatever way goats understand such things, that he had played his own small, ridiculous part in bringing together a family that had needed, more than anything else, someone patient enough and stubborn enough to keep trying, morning after morning, until love finally found its way home.